there is a chapter of human history that has been erased. Not lost, not forgotten, erased. It spans 1656 years. It begins with the first breath ever drawn by a human being, and it ends with the total annihilation of everything that lived upon the earth. Between those two moments, between the garden and the flood, there is a darkness so deep, so profound, so deliberately buried beneath centuries of silence, that most people have never even thought to ask what happened there. 1656 years. Think about what that means. Think about how much can change in a single century. Think about empires risen and fallen, about wars that rewrote the borders of the world, about ideas that split civilizations in half. Now, multiply that by 16. 16 centuries of human life on this earth before the waters came and swallowed everything whole. What happened in those years? What did the world look like before the flood? What kind of civilization could grow in 16 centuries without ever knowing death, without disease, without the slow decay of aging, without the mercy of mortality to quiet the ambitions of the powerful? The Bible tells us that God looked down at the earth during that time and saw that it was corrupt, that the wickedness of man was great, that every imagination, every intention, every whispered thought of the human heart was evil continually. Every thought, continually. What kind of world produces that? What kind of age creates that condition where the entire orientation of a species turns toward darkness so completely that even God declares it cannot be saved? That is what we are about to enter. Not a Sunday school story, not a comfortable narrative with clean edges and simple lessons. We are going to walk into those 1656 years and look at them honestly, at the shadows, at the powers that moved through them, at the beings that fell from light into something ancient and terrible, and at what they left behind on this earth before the waters erased it all. This is the story of the world that was. It begins in a garden. Not the garden you imagine when you close your eyes and think of peace. Something older, something stranger. A place where the boundary between the physical and the spiritual was so thin that God himself walked in the cool of the evening, walked as if the distance between heaven and earth was nothing more than a step across a threshold. Adam was not a primitive, not a stumbling, confused creature scratching at the dirt. The ancient rabbinical texts describe him as a being of extraordinary light, of radiance, of a kind of intelligence so vast that when God brought every creature before him, he named them all, and the names he gave were not arbitrary labels. They were declarations of essence. He saw into the nature of each living thing and spoke its truth aloud. This was the first man. And he carried within him a lifespan of nearly 1,000 years. 930 years is how long Adam lived. 930 years of memory. 930 years of watching the world he had known in perfection. Slowly, relentlessly, transform into something he could not have imagined on the day he first opened his eyes in the garden. He would outlive Abel. He would watch his son murdered by his other son. He would live long enough to see Cain's bloodline spread across the face of the earth and build the first city, not a settlement, not a camp, but a city, with a name, with walls, with the architecture of permanence. Cain named it after his son. He called it Enoch, and Adam lived on, through all of it. He watched the generations multiply. He watched the world he had broken through that single, catastrophic act of disobedience begin to calcify around its brokenness, begin to organize itself not toward restoration, but toward something else entirely, toward power. Because here is what the comfortable version of this story leaves out. In those early centuries, the line between Adam's children was not simply a family dispute. It was a cosmic divergence, two paths, two directions, two bloodlines carrying two entirely different orientations toward the divine. From Seth, Adam's third son, born after the murder of Abel, born as if in replacement, as if the story was not yet finished, came a line of men who called on the name of God, who preserved something. who carried a thread of memory back toward the garden, even as the distance grew and the light dimmed. From Cain came something else. The Book of Genesis gives us a genealogy of Cain's line, and it is strange. It is dark around the edges. In that line appears a man named Lamech, not the Lamech who would father Noah, but another one, an older one, from the cursed lineage. And Lamech speaks a poem, a song. He sings it to his two wives, and it is the first recorded poem in human history, and it is a boast about killing. He has killed a man for wounding him. He has killed a boy for striking him. And he declares that if Cain was avenged sevenfold, then Lamech shall be avenged 77-fold. This is the voice of Cain's world. This is the philosophy that was spreading across the antediluvian earth, the philosophy that power is its own justification, that strength answers to nothing, that the one who can kill does not need to explain himself to anyone, not even God. And the world was filling up. Remember how long they lived. Methuselah lived 969 years. Jared lived 962. Mahalalel, 895. These are not symbolic numbers. The ancient world took them literally. The Sumerian King List, an ancient Mesopotamian document entirely independent of the Hebrew scriptures, also records kings before the flood who reigned for tens of thousands of years. The memory of extraordinary antediluvian lifespans is not unique to Genesis. It echoes through cultures separated by oceans and centuries. What does it mean to live 900 years in a world without death? It means that the men who were born in the first century of human history were still walking the earth when the 6th and 7th and 8th centuries arrived. It means that wisdom and corruption alike had centuries to deepen, to root, to become something intractable. It means that the world was not populated by generations in the way we understand. Generations where the old pass and the new replace them with fresh eyes and new assumptions. In that world, the old never left. And in the middle of those centuries, in the years when humanity had multiplied and spread, and the cities were rising and the philosophies of power were taking hold, something happened that the Book of Genesis describes in just 3 verses. 3 verses that have been argued over, spiritualized, dismissed, and feared for 3,000 years. The sons of God saw the daughters of men, and they found them beautiful, and they came to them, and they took them as wives. And from that union came children who became the Nephilim, the giants, the mighty men of old, the men of renown. 3 verses. 3 verses that explain more about the nature of the pre-flood world than perhaps any other passage in the ancient record. Who were the sons of God? The Hebrew term is B'nai Ha-Elohim. Elsewhere in the Old Testament, that phrase is used exclusively to refer to divine beings, to angels, to members of the heavenly court, to entities that exist in a dimension beyond the human. The Book of Job uses the same phrase. So does the Septuagint, the ancient Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures, which renders them plainly as angels. The ancient world had no confusion about this passage. The earliest interpreters, Jewish scholars, early church fathers, the authors of the Dead Sea Scrolls were unanimous in their understanding. The sons of God were not men from the line of Seth. They were not pious humans who made unfortunate romantic choices. They were something else. They were watchers. That is the name the Book of Enoch gives them, the watchers. 200 of them, according to that ancient text, who descended on a mountain called Hermon, a mountain that still exists, still stands on the border between modern Syria and Lebanon, and there they made a pact. They swore an oath together, binding themselves to their decision so that none could retreat from what they were about to do. They would take human women. They would father children. They would cross the line that was never meant to be crossed. Enoch is not in the canonical Bible. That fact matters. But it is also ancient beyond dispute. Fragments of it were found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, meaning it was considered sacred reading by the communities of Qumran. The New Testament letter of Jude quotes from it directly, almost verbatim. The author of that letter expected his audience to know the text he was drawing from. And what Enoch describes is not myth. It reads like testimony. It reads like history, written by someone who is horrified by what they are recording. The Watchers did not simply father children. According to Enoch, they brought knowledge with them. They taught. They transferred to humanity things that were not meant for human hands at that time. One Watcher, named Azazel, taught men the making of weapons, of swords, of shields, of knives, and taught women the arts of cosmetic seduction, the dyeing of hair, the adorning of the body to inflame desire. Another taught sorcery. Another taught the reading of the stars for forbidden purposes. Another, the cutting of roots and the knowledge of herbs, knowledge that could heal or destroy. The Watchers were not simply demons who wanted pleasure. They were teachers, and what they taught transformed the world. Now imagine the effect of all of this on a civilization already centuries old, already drifting, already organized around the philosophy of Lamech, the philosophy of power without accountability. Into that world come beings of tremendous supernatural authority, with knowledge that human beings do not possess, who are now physically present on the earth, fathering children who inherit something of both worlds. Children who are vast, children who are powerful in ways that ordinary men are not. The Nephilim. The word itself carries weight. From the Hebrew root naphal, to fall, the fallen ones. Or, in another reading, the ones who cause others to fall, the ones who bring others down. They ate everything. The ancient text says this plainly. They consumed all the food that the normal population could produce, and then they turned on the people themselves. They turned on the animals. And then, in the darkness of what they had become, they turned on each other. The earth was filled with violence. That is the phrase Genesis uses. Filled, not troubled by, not struggling with. Filled as water fills a vessel, leaving no room for anything else. For generations, this continued. For perhaps centuries, this continued. The Nephilim grew and multiplied, and their violence became the atmosphere of the world, became the weather that everyone lived inside. There was no region untouched. There was no population unaffected. The corruption had spread like oil across water quietly, completely, without the possibility of containment. And the genetic contamination, if we dare to call it that, was spreading too. This is the darkest speculation of the ancient world, and it is not without textual support. The reason God gives for the flood is not simply that people had become wicked. Wickedness is fixable. Wickedness can be judged, can be punished, can be turned. The word God uses is the word for corruption. Corruption in the sense of something that has been damaged at the level of its essential structure. Corrupted in the way that a seed is corrupted, so that what grows from it is no longer what it was meant to be. Could it be that the interbreeding between the Watchers and humanity had spread so far through so many centuries that the genetic integrity of the human line was itself in danger? That what God saw when he looked down at the earth was not simply a civilization in moral crisis, but a species in the process of being overwritten. The text says that Noah was perfect in his generations. The word translated as perfect, tamim, in Hebrew, is a word used elsewhere to describe an animal that is without blemish, suitable for sacrifice. Unblemished, pure. And the phrase "in his generations" refers to his lineage, his ancestry, his bloodline. Noah was the last of his kind, literally perhaps. The last human being on earth whose line had not been touched by the corruption spreading through the world. Think about what that means. Think about what it would feel like to be that man. To know that everything around you is not simply wicked but fundamentally altered. That the world you were born into has become something your grandfather, the great Methuselah, still alive, still walking the earth, would not recognize from the days of his youth. Methuselah was still alive when the flood came. The math tells us so. He died in the very year the waters rose. There is an ancient tradition that says God held the flood back until Methuselah's death held it back, out of mercy, out of grace, giving the world every possible moment before the end arrived. And Enoch, Noah's great-grandfather, Methuselah's father, had already been taken, not died, taken. Genesis records it with a strange economy of language. Enoch walked with God, and then he was not, because God took him. He was 365 years old, young by the standards of that age, and he was removed from the earth. Why was he removed? What had he seen? What did he know? The Book of Enoch gives us his testimony. He had walked among the watchers. He had been shown the dimensions of heaven and hell. He had been sent as a messenger to the imprisoned angels, carrying God's judgment to beings who had known the divine face and chosen, in full knowledge, to betray it.
And the sons of heaven
He
saw
had
the
seen
daughters
the
of men.
future. He had seen the
Thus,
flood coming
the
before
great
it
corruption
came.
began.
And then
To the
he was
bride and
gone.
groom.
As if
And to
God
us,
could not bear
the
to
feast
let
is
that
magnificent.
particular
It is
light go
perfect.
out in the darkness that the world had become. For 120 years, Noah built. 120 years of hammering wood in a world without oceans, without rain as we know it. The earth in that age, watered by mist, rising from the ground, the sky a different thing from what it is today. And everyone could see what he was doing. Everyone knew. They walked past, they watched, they laughed, perhaps, or feared, or simply did not understand what they were witnessing. What must those years have been like? To be the last righteous man on earth, building a ship in a world that has never seen a flood, surrounded by beings, some of them not fully human, who carry in their eyes the darkness of 200 generations of accelerating corruption. To know that you are not simply building a vessel, you are building the only vessel, the only thing standing between the end of the human story and its continuation. Noah had 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. From those 3 sons, after the flood, every human being on this earth would descend. Every civilization, every language, every culture, every war, every act of love, every prayer ever spoken into the darkness, every child ever born. All of it would flow from those 3 men, standing on that boat, watching the world they knew disappear beneath waters that came from 2 directions at once, from above, as the windows of heaven opened, and from below, as the fountains of the great deep were broken up. The ancient world did not simply drown, it collapsed. The geological architecture of the earth cracked open. The water that filled the original deep surged upward. The sky that had held its moisture in a great canopy above released everything it had been holding. For 40 days the deluge fell. For 150 days the waters dominated the earth. Mountains were covered. Every high place was swallowed. Every city, every monument, every record, every artifact of 1656 years of human civilization went beneath the water. And the Nephilim. What happened to them? The text says all flesh died that moved upon the earth. All. The Nephilim were flesh. Whatever else they were, they died with everything else. But here is what the ancient tradition also preserves. The spirits of the Nephilim, being hybrid, neither fully human nor fully angelic, had nowhere to go when they died. They could not return to heaven, for they were not pure spirit. They could not undergo the ordinary dissolution of the human dead. They became something the ancient world called unclean spirits, homeless, wandering, seeking bodies to
Shadows
inhabit,
stir,
seeking
whisper
warmth,
of an awakening.
seeking the
I have
physical
seen the
existence
path
they
to
had
darkness.
lost. Some
Witness the
traditions say
power that
this
will
is where the
reshape this
concept of
world.
demonic possession originates, not in mythology, not in superstition, but in a very specific theological event, the death of hybrid beings in the flood of Noah, and the continued existence of their spirits as disembodied forces moving through the post-flood world. The Watchers themselves, the 200 who descended on Hermon, were imprisoned. The Book of Enoch and the letter of Jude and the second letter of Peter all preserve this memory. They are bound in darkness, in chains, reserved for judgment. Their fate was not death, but confinement. They exist still, in whatever dimension holds them, waiting. But what they built, what they created, what they taught, what they seeded into the human imagination across 16 centuries that did not entirely disappear beneath the waters. Because Noah and his sons carried it with them, in memory, in language, in the bones of every culture that would arise from their descendants. The stories of the Watchers echoed across the post-flood world and became the mythologies of every ancient civilization. The gods of Mesopotamia, the Titans of Greece, the Anunnaki of Sumer, the divine kings of Egypt, the giants of Canaan that the Israelite spies saw centuries later and described as beings beside whom they felt like grasshoppers. The memory of what the world was before the flood was not erased. It was transformed into legend, into religion, into the stories that every culture tells about where it came from and why the world is the way it is. And beneath all of those stories, if you are willing to look, if you are willing to sit with the discomfort of what they might mean, there is a thread that runs through all of them. Something came down, something that was not supposed to be here. It changed what the world was, and then judgment fell. That thread runs through the mythology of the entire ancient world, across cultures that had no contact with one another, in languages that share no common roots, in geographies separated by thousands of miles of ocean. The flood itself is recorded in over 200 distinct cultural traditions across the globe. Over 200 stories, many of them sharing specific details. The warning given to one righteous man, the building of a vessel, the survival of animals, the waters receding, the covenant that followed. Over 200. This is not coincidence. This is memory. The kind of memory that survives not in documents, but in the structure of the stories a people tells their children, the stories their children tell their children, century after century after century. Because something happened that was so total, so absolute, so complete in its destruction of everything that had existed before, that the human soul could not let go of it. The world before the flood is not simply a religious question, it is a human question. It is the question of what we are, what we were made to be, what we became in our freedom, what forces moved through our history before our history was written, and what those forces left behind. Because the ancient records do not suggest that the Nephilim were a unique event, a one-time experiment that the flood closed permanently. The children of Israel were commanded, when they entered Canaan, to destroy utterly the inhabitants of certain cities. Utterly. Every man, woman, and child. Commands that have troubled ethical thinkers for centuries. Commands that seem impossible to reconcile with a God of mercy, until you read what the text says about who those people were. Anakim, Rephaim, giants, men of great stature. The same words, the same root memories, appearing in the post-flood world as if someone had tried again. There are questions here that do not have clean answers. There are threads that, if you pull them, unravel things that are more comfortable left intact. That is the nature of this territory. But perhaps that discomfort is the point. Perhaps the story of those 1656 years is not meant to be a historical curiosity, not meant to be the domain of archaeologists and theologians arguing in academic journals. Perhaps it is meant to do what the most dangerous stories always do, to hold up a mirror. The world before the flood was not populated by monsters. It was populated by human beings making choices, choosing power over accountability, choosing immediate desire over long consequence, choosing to ignore the voices that said wait, that said stop, that said this is not what you are meant for, choosing to welcome the knowledge offered by forces that did not have their best interest at heart, because the knowledge was dazzling and the power it promised was real. And there was one man in the entire world, who made a different choice, who walked with God when walking with God had become the most countercultural act imaginable, who built what he was told to build even when everything around him said that what he was doing was absurd. Noah did not save the world. He could not save the world. The world had passed the point where saving was possible. What he did was something quieter and more profound than that. He preserved the possibility of a new world. He carried the human story through its darkest hour in the hold of a wooden ship, surrounded by the sound of animals and the smell of rain, waiting for the waters to recede and the earth to dry, and God to say, "Now, now you can begin again." There is something in that image that speaks to something very old in the human soul. Because we all know what it is to live in a world that feels corrupted beyond repair. We all know what it is to be surrounded by a noise so loud, so pervasive, so saturating that the idea of hearing anything else seems almost ridiculous. We all know what it is to wonder whether the forces moving through our age are forces we understand, or forces older and stranger than anything we have a name for. The pre-flood world is not ancient history. It is a pattern, and patterns, by their nature, repeat. There is a reason Jesus, when asked about the signs of the end, did not point to political upheaval or natural disaster as the primary comparison. He pointed to the days of Noah. As it was in the days of Noah, he said, so will it be at the coming of the Son of Man. They were eating and drinking. They were marrying and being given in marriage. Life was continuing, ordinary and oblivious, right up until the moment the flood came. Not the wickedness alone, not the violence alone, the obliviousness, the normalcy of everything, even as the waters were gathering. What does it take to remain awake in an age that encourages sleep? What does it take to build something quietly, persistently, against the mockery of the world when everything around you insists that what you are building is useless? What does it take to be the kind of person who, when God looks down at the earth, is found to be the one who has not been swallowed by the age they live in? The 1656 years before the flood ended in silence, in water, in the absence of everything that had been. But that silence was not the end of the story. It was its pivot point. The moment when the weight of what humanity had become tipped finally, catastrophically, over the edge, and in the space that opened up, something was preserved. Something small, something fragile, something floating on the waters of destruction, waiting for the dove to return with a branch in its mouth. The world before the flood is gone. Whatever it built, whatever it knew, whatever monuments it raised, and whatever knowledge it accumulated across 16.5 centuries gone beneath the water, beneath the sediment, beneath the silence of 4,000 years of a world that came after. But the questions it raises do not go down with it. They surface in every age, in every civilization, in every human heart that has ever stood at the edge of the darkness and wondered what is out there. What came before? What fell? What it left behind? And what, if anything, we are still carrying?